Welcome you to this webinar series on early childhood development. I'm your host, Karin Weiss. I'm project lead at Medicus Mundi Switzerland, and Medicus Mundi Switzerland is a network of nearly 50 NGOs working in international health cooperation. This webinar series was developed based on their interest, on the interest of our member organizations, to dig deeper into this topic and integrate this concept more and more into their projects and programs. 350 million children younger than 5 years in low and middle income countries are at risk of not achieving their developmental potential due to poverty and nutritional deficit. A poor start in life because of maternal distress, depression, or mental disorders, malnutrition, or a lack of social safety net, to name a few, limits a child's ability to benefit from education and love. Nurturing care is necessary for the physical and psychological development of a child. The evidence now strongly suggests that parents, caregivers, and families need to be supported in providing nurturing care and protection. In this webinar series, we explore the question, what is nurturing care and what interventions can be integrated into the existing health systems and how, so that they become an integral part of sexual and reproductive health services. Today, we hear from two wonderful experts, Bernadette Daelmans and Sheila Manji, what nurturing care is. Bernadette is unit head at the Child Health and Development Unit at the World Health Organization, whereas Sheila is early childhood development specialist at the same unit. We will first listen to their speeches before we go into a Q&A session. So please feel free to comment in the chat box or ask your questions. We will address them as soon as possible. So now I kindly ask you to turn off your mobile phone, switch off your email account so that you can be fully present and listen to Sheila and Bernadette today, wonderful talks. Welcome to both of you. Thank you so much for taking part, Sheila and Bernadette. The floor is now yours.
Thank you, Corinne, for this introduction, and good morning, good afternoon, maybe good evening, wherever you are. So Sheila and I are going to share a short presentation. We hope to be able to limit it to 20 minutes so that after that we have good time for discussion. Sheila, would you give me the next slide? So first, to look in general to say when we talk about nurturing care and early childhood development, why do we do so and what do we want to achieve? So here is a small quote from one of our colleagues with whom we have been working intensively at the WHO, but also in UNICEF and other organizations over the past year, Ms. Joan Lombardi, who stated that what we want to see is healthy birth, children who are thriving at age 3, children who are eager and curious at age 5, so they are ready to go to school and learn, and successful when they reach 3rd grades. Those are outcomes that we are looking for. So keep this in mind as a background as we go through the next slides. Next, Sheila. So what is early childhood development? A few words around the broad concept, because by definition, early childhood development refers to the period from conception to age 8. But within that, we can distinguish critical periods, conception to birth, when fetal growth and development take place, first from birth to 3 years, and we often refer to that as the early years in short. And then comes preschool and pre-primary years and the early grades of primary years. So as we go through this presentation, you will see that we focus predominantly on point 1 and point 2 from conception till 3 years, as that is the focus of the nurturing care concept and nurturing care framework. When we talk about development, what do we mean? We speak then about the continuous process of acquiring skills and abilities during these childhood years across domains of cognition, language, physical, motor, social, and emotional development, all domains that are essential for a person to holistically develop and apply their capabilities within their home environment, within society, within the formal services that they access, such as an education. Now, how do we promote development? There we use the concept of nurturing care that, as I said before, may particularly have been coined for the earliest age groups, but is actually applicable throughout the whole period of early childhood development, and we would say even beyond into adolescence. And so what does nurturing care refer to? It refers to a stable environment that is sensitive to children's health and nutritional needs, with protection from threats, opportunities for early learning and interactions that are responsive, emotionally supportive, and developmentally stimulating. We'll get back to these concepts in the next slide. So where does the evidence come from nurturing care? You may be familiar with the Lancet series that came out in 2016, Advancing Early Childhood Developments from Science to Scale. And in that series, there were a few key messages articulated. The first is that the foundation for lifelong health, productivity, and well-being is built in these early years, from pregnancy till age 3. At that time, at least 250 million children under 5 years, which represented 43%, were found to be at risk of not achieving their development potential, just looking at 2 risk factors alone: extreme poverty and stunting. Those figures have been recalculated 5 years onwards, and so now the percentage is 37%. The number of children remains the same. So nurturing care then is what a young child needs to develop, not only physically, but also mentally and socially. And in doing so, the series demonstrated that that helps to reduce inequities within communities, within societies, between countries. An important point that the series made is the role of the health sector. Often, ECD is understood as something that deals with learning, and education and protection are important, but this series articulated the critical role that the health sector can play in supporting caregivers to provide good nurturing care, and so that is part of the discussion we are going to go have how to achieve that. ECD, the title is not correct here. So rapid brain development happens in the first years of life. And as we can see, sort of from birth onwards, is more rapid than at any other time in life. 90% of brain growth happens by the time a child enters school age. So if you look at the graph on the left side, you can see where this evidence comes from. You see here the speed of synapse formation for essential functions, senses, language, cognitive, intellectual functions, and you see that the synapse formation is at its most rapid starting from conception, but in the early month of years of life, and that is so when the brain is appropriately stimulated. But what you see in contrast in the figures of the 2 brain scans on the right side is that when a child is not sufficiently stimulated, maybe subject to stress that is very severe, then those connections are not being formed, and so the brain is being deprived from making these essential synapse formations that enable functions to develop. And so responsive interactions with caregivers are needed because it helps to build a child brain, and it protects the child from exposure to stress and the negative impacts that toxic stress may have on early brain development. Next. So when we then try to quantify this and say, what are these benefits? Then I like to highlight three important kind of findings. The first is that the Nobel economist James Heckman found that investment in high quality multisectoral early childhood development can have a 13% return on investment. And as you can see in the graph on this slide, those investments are highest in the earliest years. Similarly, UNICEF's research has found that every dollar spent on primary education results in a $9 benefit on societies. And when we look more granular into a study that has taken place in Jamaica to promote early interventions focused on parenting, early learning, and psychosocial development for young children that were also nutritionally compromised, then we found that those efforts led to an increase in learning by up to earning by up to 25% later in life, which was also supported by better school attainments earlier. Next. So the Nurturing Care Framework tries to bring these key findings together and builds off the Lancet series key messages in order to provide a roadmap for actions that illustrate why efforts must begin in the earliest year, from pregnancy to age 3, how nurturing care protects children from the worst effects of adversity, and what caregivers need in order to provide nurturing care. Next. So I'm going to illustrate two seminal figures that are part of the nurturing care framework. The first are the components of nurturing care. Those are what a child's brain and body expects and needs to grow and develop. Good health, adequate nutrition, security and safety, opportunities for early learning, and responsive caregiving. Next. But in order to be able for caregivers to provide nurturing care and children to receive it, we do need an enabling environment. And so the framework also alerts us that for nurturing care, caregivers need to have capabilities to provide that care. They need to be supported by communities that are empowered to create the environment that enables nurturing care. It illustrates the role of services that are supportive for caregivers and individual children, providing the essential interventions. And then we will look briefly at the enabling policies that are essential for caregivers to have both time and resources to provide nurturing care. Next. So here is a brief summary of the 5 components, and with this slide I like to hand over to Sheila, who is going to lead us into the detail of what each of those means. Sheila, over to you.
Thanks, Bernadette. Greetings, everybody. So yes, let's take a little bit of a closer look at these 5 components of nurturing care. It's important to understand that they all work together. They all support each other. So as we think about the work that we do going forward, we want to look for ways to ensure that all 5 are being given attention. So when we speak of good health, we are talking about the health of the mother and the caregivers, the caregivers and the children. We're referring to both because we know that the physical and mental health of the caregivers can also affect their ability to care for the child. Similarly, when we speak about adequate nutrition, we are referring both to the maternal nutrition as well as child nutrition, because here again, we know that the nutritional status of the mother during pregnancy affects her health and the well-being of herself as well as of her unborn child. And after birth, also, the nutritional status of the mother affects her ability to breastfeed and provide adequate care. Both health and nutrition, these would be most familiar to you, and these are 2 components that are already being well supported through existing health and nutrition services. The next 3 are perhaps given less attention or maybe seen as somewhat new, and these are the 3 that we hope to see more and more attention given to in our routine services. The safety and security, here we're talking about the environments to see that they are physically safe, emotionally safe, environmentally safe, that there's access to food and water, that we are free of any toxins, any dangers in the environment. For opportunities for early learning, here we're talking about opportunities for the infant or the child to interact with a person, place, or object in their environment. It implies that any interaction, whether it's positive or negative, or even the absence of an interaction, is contributing to the child's brain development and laying the foundation for later learning. So when Bernadette was showing us the scans of the brain and showing us whether a child was getting exposure or opportunities to interact with others, to interact with objects, that those everyday moments are actually laying the blueprint for the brain's architecture. And so this is why we really stress the importance of early learning. It is true, as Bernadette said, that very often when we talk about early childhood development, or we talk about this component in particular, there's a tendency to think about formal learning and what takes place in a creche or a daycare or a school. But in fact, here, as we've talked about, the nurturing care framework really emphasizes what happens in those early years before children attend a formal learning program. So in that context, when we think about early learning, we're thinking about opportunities for infants, for babies, for toddlers to use their bodies. So reaching for an object, kicking their legs, interacting with objects and people, exploring their surroundings. So not sitting in the same place all the time, but being taken around to different places so that they get to see different things and interact with different places in their home or in their community. Activate their senses. They have opportunities to see different things, to touch different things, hear different things. And very importantly, that they are spoken to, that they get opportunities to hear language as well as use language. So they're encouraged to coo, to babble, to try expressing themselves verbally and non-verbally, and have opportunities to hear that also. All of this happens in the context of everyday routines and with using everyday objects that are at home. We don't need anything special. And probably a lot of this will sound familiar to you: the smiling, the eye contact, talking and singing, reading and telling stories, modeling and imitation, simple games like peekaboo. All of this happens, but sometimes it is under-recognized or undervalued. It's not seen as integral and important. And what this component tries to do is to bring attention to the fact that these everyday experiences are very, very instrumental and should be reinforced and continued. The fifth component is responsive caregiving. Of the five, we consider this one the foundational component, and I'll explain why in just a second. This component refers to the ability of the caregiver to notice, understand, and respond to the child's signals in a timely and appropriate manner. When we talk about responsive caregiving, we're looking at, can the caregiver notice or observe and respond to the child's movements, sounds, gestures, and verbal requests? That has three elements. Can they read the child's cues? Can they interpret what the child needs or wants? So can they make meaning of what that cue is trying to communicate? And do they respond in a manner that is appropriate, consistent, affectionate, and predictable? The picture in the corner may be a little bit difficult to see, but if we use that as an example, you can see in the first step, the child is looking up to the mother, perhaps signaling that they are ready for a next spoonful. And they have the mouth open, the spoon is ready to go in the mouth. So the mother has read the cue. The child is ready for the next spoonful. They've interpreted. They interpret this to mean that the child wants more, that they are still hungry, that they would like more food. And they respond appropriately by offering another spoon of food. I mentioned that this component is considered the foundational component. And we say that because responsive caregiving is the basis for everything else. A responsive caregiver is more likely to recognize and respond to signs of illness. They're more likely to responsibly feed, protect their child against injury and the negative effects of adversity, build trust and social relationships. Responsive caregiving helps with bonding, security, and emotional well-being, and it's the basis for learning and well-being now and well into the future. The WHO has released a set of guidelines, the Early Childhood Development Guidelines, which bring further attention to these last two components that we mentioned, responsive caregiving and early learning. They stipulate that all children in their first 3 years of life should receive responsive care and early learning activities, and these should be provided by their parents and other caregivers, and that we should be supporting parents and other caregivers to provide this to their children. It also emphasizes the need to integrate caregiving and nutrition interventions, and it also brings attention to the importance of supporting maternal mental health. So if we go back to the nurturing care framework, there are 5 strategic actions that are outlined in the framework, and we have since released the nurturing care handbook. The first draft is available online, which goes into further guidance on what each of these mean, what can be done, and how best to support them. And we can provide more examples during the discussion if you like. But it all starts with having the right enabling environment, and particularly the enabling policies. Many times we tend to focus on the multisectoral early childhood development policy, which is absolutely essential. It does ensure that all sectors are at the table thinking through their roles and responsibilities and what can be done in a comprehensive manner. But there are also lots of sector-specific policies and plans that equally contribute to early childhood development. So here's an example here, but you may also think about the health sector policies and plans and how those are framed and what they are giving attention to and how they might be strengthened in the future to ensure that the 5 components of nurturing care are given attention. When it comes to services, the main message that we like to convey here is that there are existing services. The health and nutrition services are the first point of contact for families with young children, and we need to look for ways to maximize how these services are provided so that they can better support caregivers to provide nurturing care. So we know that these services do at the facility and in the community do focus on good health and adequate nutrition, and that needs to continue. But we can also look for ways to strengthen attention to safety and security, opportunities for early learning and responsive caregiving. Next week, you will have an opportunity to learn more about how this can be done. There is a subsequent resource that we have been developing with UNICEF called the Practice Guide, in which we go into more detail about how these different existing services can be maximized. Another key message that we have is that all children and all caregivers need some support. And so what you have here is on the left side is who needs support, and on the right side is the intensity of the intervention to support those families. So everyone needs some support, and that's what you see on the bottom there. And that support comes through the routine services that exist, the universal support. But there are some families that need a little bit more. So they need the minimum support, the basic support that everybody gets, but they also need something else. In the middle, you would have families and children that are at risk. They may be children that have risk factors that may need further attention to avoid a risk of poor child development. It could be malnutrition, poverty, HIV. It could be living in a humanitarian context, places where there are vulnerabilities or people that are experiencing vulnerabilities that need an additional support. And then at the top tier, you have individuals that need further support, indicated support, perhaps because of a chronic ongoing condition, could be disability, could be a single parent family who need the minimum support, but also need further support. And so it's important as we think about how we are using our services to make sure that, especially at that bottom tier, we are identifying families that need that additional support and we make that available. There are a number of resources that we could talk about. We won't go into them here. We encourage you to look at the Nurturing Care website and have a look through, particularly if you want more information on the Nurturing Care components, that is available there. The handbook goes into information about the 5 strategic actions. It includes lots of case studies. There are many different briefs from countries and thematic briefs that go into how things can be done, what can be done in different places or for different populations. For example, there is a brief on nurturing care for children living in humanitarian settings, which articulates what we could be doing differently going forward to ensure the youngest children and their families get the support they need. We're happy to talk more about any of these or others. And I think we'll leave it there and we'll look forward to your questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Sheila and Bernadette, for this wonderful talk and for these insights into early childhood development. That was very, very comprehensive, and I made a lot of notes so that we can include all the links to the references you made to the reports and the framework, and we will send them out in the next email. Now we wait for the questions, which surely come in shortly. From my perspective, because my background is psychology, so in my psychology degree, we were going into bonding. We talked a lot about early childhood development, how important it is on the brain, on all it is what you mentioned today, but also on the concept of bonding. And that, and I found it always interesting because every sector is talking a bit differently, even though it's this, you mean the same. How do you implement it afterwards also in your, how do you go out with these frameworks? How do you bring how do you bring it to the people so that they understand it, that they are willing to incorporate it into their policies and programs?
Sheila, shall I take a first step and then you? First to say that we are sort of at an auspicious moment, because at this particular period in time, there are a lot of influences coming together. We have left the period of the MDGs. We are looking at social development goals, and as many of you may know, there are specific targets related to early childhood development. Target 4.2.2 looks at sort of enabling all boys and girls to be ready to enter schooling and to have had a full development trajectory up till then. So there is this high level attention and commitment. Then we look at kind of major development institution, financial banks like the World Bank have human capital front and center in sort of their vision of where they need to invest, and so they have interactions with government leaders around that. When we look at the place where we are working and we know well, health, then we see that the evidence shows that maybe the focus that was earlier strongly oriented around communicable diseases, survival, and so forth, needs to change towards healthy growth and development, because of the life course perspective, the prevention of non-communicable diseases, the desire of populations to kind of go into healthy aging trajectories. So that means that at the country level, policymakers and program managers show a keen interest into this agenda and are actually eager to say, and how are we going to do that? Now, from the perspective of health, there is clear opportunity, as Sheila presented, to start that looking at the existing services that are there and makes incremental changes to upgrade those services to provide universal support, but on top of that, also think about those children and populations at risk that may need a bit more intensive support. And for that, there is a series of programs that are sort of structured sessions that have been tried and tested and can be considered by countries to say, how would that work for us? How do we want to adapt? So overall, since the Lancet series, we have seen a flurry of countries showing interest, first to introduce the series, the key messages, and then when the Nurturing Care framework came, to start working on that. Is this an agenda that can be achieved in a short term to say, if we do this, then the job is done? No. This is a long trajectory to build systems that think differently and provide different services, but the small doable actions that can make that stakeholders can do something today have been clearly identified, and we see in countries that work is going on in that respect. So maybe Sheila, a few notes that you may want to say in addition to that. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think, and this may help answer Martin's question in the chat too around what is needed most to strengthen the enabling environment. We showed you the 5 strategic actions And you saw that the first one is lead and invest. And it's not to say that we need to start there, but what we have consistently seen is that without that, it's very difficult to move forward, particularly at scale. And so we have, there have been different ways of going about socializing the concept of nurturing care or sensitizing partners, governments to the nurturing care framework and thinking through some next steps. Sometimes it has been, the civil society has been looking for ways to pilot with the government different models that work in that context, and then working with the government to think through how to scale it up. Sometimes it has started with a large-scale meeting, a multisectoral meeting, bringing together diverse sectors and diverse stakeholders where they can dive deeper into what the science is saying, what the framework is saying, and analyzing a bit more where they want to go next. I mean, as Bernadette has said, it's not going to be as simple, we just tick this box and we're done. And there are a lot of different parts and moving parts. And so a big piece is to think through what is already happening and should continue, and then what are the gaps and what are small things that can change over time. I recall that in Ethiopia, big things that they did there that really helped move things along was they did a lot of sensitization around the key messages in the Lancet series. They did strategic field visits with high-level policymakers. They exposed policymakers to educational courses where they were able to learn about the science. And all of these things in different ways contribute to each other, and they create sort of prime people to be ready to receive the nurturing care framework. We've seen that in Mozambique also, and in other places. It takes a lot of advocacy work, a lot of sensitization in different ways. And then there's this all of a sudden receptiveness and readiness to say, okay, we get it. We know we need to do something. What do we need to do? And that's where the framework now helps you think through the what next and how to do it.
Thank you, Sheila. And Bernadette, we have another question coming from Maria. She's from the Early Childhood Development Global. She's a global specialist, and she will be talking in the third webinar. And she is asking about the WHO caregiving skills training, because she has heard of it. And she was wondering where you are at with it, and whether there are already draft materials or whether it's already published.
I'm most happy that we just spoke about it last week. So this is a tool that's being developed by our sister department, Mental Health and Substance Abuse. Our colleague Chiara Savilli is responsible. And so I understand that the tool is going to be released very soon, next month. There are parts to it. There is capacity development for health service providers. There will also be an app that can be used by clients, the caregivers themselves, in order to work through and pick up sort of good tips and guidance that way. So this is a space to look out for, and I would expect that when the tool is ready in April, that there will be some sort of an event, a webinar, to which many then can participate. So we will follow up, and maybe in our next webinar in this series, we can communicate if there's any more clarity on a precise date or how the launch event will take place.
Fantastic.
So just for colleagues who don't know the tool, the caregivers skills training is meant for parents of children who have a developmental disability or difficulty, to help the caregiver develop their capacity to understand the child, how does the child communicate, and then to be able to provide responsive, nurturing care to children. It also pays attention to the well-being of the caregiver themselves, as they may be challenged in kind of trying to understand their child and accompanying them on that trajectory. So it's a very kind of complementary tool that fits with what we have been presented, foundational skills that promote this bonding aspect, as you said, responsive caregiving, early learning, and then a bit extra for those caregivers and children who may have some difficulties on that trajectory of development.
Thank you so much. That will be very, very important and insightful, because if a child has some sort of disability, it's even more difficult to give responsive care, because you don't know the signs very well, and maybe you don't even know that it has some sort of disability. Cecilia, we understand that a policy framework is necessary when, in case of lack of political willingness, NGOs could directly implement in a country. What would be your suggestion for starting the work there?
Maybe Sheila, you would want to reflect on that first?
Sure. I think you're very right, Cecilia, and it's true. It's how it's happened in a lot of places. It has started within civil society and then percolated upwards. And I think, there are a lot of existing training packages that can be really useful here, such as Care for Child Development, Reach Up and Learn, Caring for the Child's Healthy Growth and Development, Thinking Healthy, or Caring for the Caregiver if you're thinking about caregiver well-being. And those are good places to start, and they are being used in many, many different places in the world. So if you were thinking to explore any of those, you might want to first find out whether one of those or more of those packages is already being used in your context, because in any of those packages, you need to think through how they can apply in your context. They would need to be adapted. What we've seen civil society actors do is take those packages and look for opportunities to integrate, either train on those packages or integrate the content from those packages into existing trainings in an in-service training, or increasingly, we're now looking at pre-service training opportunities and how that could be explored in the future. It could also be working with associations, pediatric associations, nursing associations. Any opportunities you can take to work with and through them can really help you mobilize a much wider outreach and sensitize a much broader population. And they themselves can then come forward with solutions and ideas of how to permeate through services. Bernadette?
Nothing to add, Sheila, just to say many options. Is it for getting started? I think the one key message is don't necessarily wait till government is ready, but whatever you can do in small ways, communicate, advocate, so that the knowledge percolates upwards and people can start internalizing it, what you are doing, why, and the impacts that it has. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. And I was wondering, which country is most advanced with regards to early childhood development?
That is a difficult question, because we, of course, see when we scan the world that there are some countries that took at a very early stage sort of a decision to say we need a national program that supports children's development. When we look in high-income countries, Australia, the US, UK, Scotland, you have these programs that support child well-being, and sort of many concepts that we promote under nurturing care are part of that. When we look at countries with lesser resources, then we can, for example, see that India has an ICDS program that in principle provides the infrastructure to reach families and children at this young age. One of the issues with these older programs on scale is, do they actually deliver what can be delivered? And we see that a country like India is working now at upgrading their system by saying we are not only working through our Anganwadi workers and focusing on children that are a bit older, we try to bring this back to pregnancy, the newborn period, and bring in our rural health workforce to contribute to promoting early childhood development, healthy growth and development of children, and find that synergy. When we look all across, we see activities in all regions that countries are working to strengthen system. Brazil is rolling out a very big program that sort of has used care for child development as one of the tools. It's currently being evaluated. We often refer to examples like Recio Contigo ago in Chile. This was built up from grassroots, and where antenatal care and sort of the services upwards are really sort of a vehicle for reaching families and children, supporting them and identifying those that are most vulnerable. When we go now to the African continent, we are working more intensively there at present. Then we see a range of countries that are sort of engaging on this trajectory. Sheila already mentioned the example of Ethiopia. We see Zambia, Kenya, Mozambique, Rwanda, Uganda. In all these countries in West Africa, similar Côte d'Ivoire, Senegal, where there are activities that are supportive of this agenda. And so what we are doing there together with UNICEF and other partners is facilitate that countries can come together, exchange experience, look at what the evidence says through nurturing care, and find then sort of the next avenue and priorities of how they want to continue strengthening systems. So a lot of learning between countries. And so for that, we are happy to have the Nurturing Care website, where we try to showcase examples of what is there. We also have the ECD Action Network that goes beyond the early years and looks at education, protection, brings in all the elements around ECD 0 to 8. That also does a lot of knowledge management and knowledge exchange. And so in that respect, we feel we are globally on a collective learning exercise, but backed up with quite a good commitment, I would say, in a certain group of countries. Sheila, that you may want to add to.
No, I think it's very true. There are different trajectories in every country depending on their starting point. And depending on how vibrant or not the civil society sector is, but also, how the readiness and willingness of the government, all these different pieces come together at different times. And it does, I remember our colleagues in Mozambique telling us that it was after many, many years of sensitization that all of a sudden this opportunity, large-scale funding opportunity came, and the government went, we want to do this differently. Right? And then there was this readiness, they had understood the why, and then they were able to seize the opportunity. So you may think, oh, it's not happening here, it's a country that's lagging behind, and it's not. It's just waiting for its moment to really seize an opportunity that's coming its way. I think what we have seen, and this responds a bit to Martin's question about how implementation of the framework might have been affected by the pandemic. I think what we've seen, and I think it may actually come into Mariam's question too, but with the pandemic, yes, absolutely, focus shifted. Everybody was focusing on the pandemic. However, opportunities came about also. And so where there are individuals, be they in civil society, academics, governments, that were involved in response plans, recovery plans, they were able to seize those opportunities and integrate responses that may not have been there a few years ago, right? And I think that's what we consistently see, is that when people have been made aware and passionately see this as important, they will seize the opportunities. Even in the face of a pandemic, they will see opportunities there and use those. And to the question about, where do we start, multisectoral or sectoral? You need both. But you may do one and not the other, or you may put more emphasis on one and not the other. But definitely in health, it's not enough to just say the Ministry of Health is at the table working on the multisectoral plan. That's definitely not enough. Within the Ministry of Health, there are so many different departments. And oftentimes we may be working with one department, or maybe two, maybe even three, but not all the departments. And so what we can do better is to look for opportunities to sensitize, socialize, bring along all the relevant departments in the Ministry of Health.
Maybe it's fair to add, colleagues, that because of the nurturing care framework, sort of a later child on the block, we see in countries that it facilitates that different sectors come together to think together. And then, as they plan, have a joint vision of what they want to achieve, then again, it comes to the sector's responsibility to execute and do their part of what they can do in order then so multisectorality is essential, can be a hurdle if people get stuck in discussions, but can be a great facilitators when sort of people can formulate their joint vision and then sort of be supported within mandate of each sector to do what is necessary in order to move forward. Of course, for the level of the individual child, and particularly the most vulnerable families, we need to see that convergence of services, whether it's social protection, education, health, so that we don't have fragmentation. The children still fall through the maze of the net because nobody picks them up when sort of the need is there to do so. But so these are things that will take time for systems to develop. Some countries have them very prominently. We referred to Africa. There's a lot of work going on in several countries of Eastern Europe, where home visitation program, the integration of disciplines into transdisciplinary care is getting a lot of attention.
Thank you so much. What I really hear is how important the civil society is in moving the agenda forwards on early childhood development. What else can we do? How do you see the driving force from our side, besides starting lobbying it, but what exactly can the civil society really do in order to bring this agenda forward?
Shall I start?
Yes, please, Sheila.
Sure. No, absolutely. Advocacy is essential. I think that advocacy is a key driver in this agenda. In many countries, there are elements of a national network for early childhood development. Some that are very civil society and some that are a mix of civil society and government. So that's a really good opportunity to be part of a larger consortium of actors in a country, because obviously the more people saying the same messages, the more likely we are to see some action. But even as organizations, I think a lot of internal sensitization within your own organization can go a long, long way. And we're all working on our specific things and our specific departments, but our leadership, do they understand this? Our partners working in other sectors of our organization or other departments, do they understand? So sometimes we think about advocacy, external advocacy, but there's a lot of internal advocacy that can be done also. I think civil society has opportunities to attract money to a country, and that money can be used creatively to do things differently, and use the opportunities, whether that's work at services or work in communities or work through and with other partners, to use that money in a way that does allow for different models to be tried, to be tested. We need to learn more about what works, where and when and how, so the implementation research, because now the bigger question on everybody's minds is, okay, we know this is important, but what do we really need to do so that we can scale, right? So, there's lots of pilots that have been done around the world, but we need to start thinking about what are the ingredients that can be scaled. And that's what's going to help a government think about, okay, I need to do X, Y, Z, I need this much money. Okay, if I do this, then this is how I can take it forward. So if civil society can use their opportunities and the work that they're doing on the ground to answer some of those questions, it will further advance the work and allow it to permeate other parts of the country.
And maybe just to add, there is the big component of focus on families and their communities. So, of course, civil society is very diverse in who is all under that big umbrella and how different organizations work. But for those that are really sort of embedded in grassroots, in supporting communities, anything they do to make sort of the environment for children and their families more safe, more friendly, more stimulating are big contributions to the agenda. So one doesn't always have to think sort of on the big plan and what we are doing on the big plan, but also what can be done locally that creates that environment that supports nurturing care through the different components, whether it's safety, security, early learning, providing access to health services where that is a challenge, and so forth. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. So we will certainly see what we can do and do more advocacy on that topic. Are there any questions from the audience coming in? Anything which you still want to know from Sheila and Bernadette?
I have a question, Karin, because I would love the audience. Are we talking about an agenda that is new for people, or actually are there people in the audience who said, we are working on this. We maybe not under the same umbrella, nurturing care or nurturing care framework, but in the way we are sort of managing our programs, there are elements that are very recognizable of what we are discussing now. Just to get a feel where in this audience we are, and there may be people who are quite ready or advanced in implementation without us knowing it and giving a lot of information.
Fantastic question. That is true. We could have done a poll on this. Yeah, okay. We just put into the chat where we are at the moment with your understanding on early childhood development. Yeah, exactly. Cecilia, they are on their way. Vincent, we are on your page. Thank you very much. Maria says she's obviously a specialist on this topic, so she has been working quite a long time on this. Oh, and from France, they have a political framework on this. Fantastic. Who else wants to come forward? From looking at the participants list, I think it's quite a mix of a mixed group. Some are more advanced, some are new to it. I think we have a bit of everything in this group. And we will do the poll for the next webinar next week. Yeah, and in Switzerland, I think we are far behind. Do you think so? I think we do quite a lot in terms of bonding and nurturing care. Yeah. Yeah, and children with disabilities, that is definitely. I think we will address also children with special needs, especially in the third webinar.
And I just mentioned, I think I mentioned that there are thematic briefs for nurturing care, because what we recognize, the framework is quite broad. And so there was a desire to go a little bit deeper for specific populations or specific issues. So on the website, and we can put the link for you, there's a series of thematic briefs that have already been developed and other ones coming forward. But ones that may interest this group, for example, might be the one on nurturing care for children living in humanitarian settings, which particularly looks at that issue more deeply. But just looking at what's coming through the chat, there is one that we are developing at the moment on nurturing care for children with developmental delays or disabilities, which is looking more closely at, what do we mean when we say nurturing care for this population, and what would that look like, and what can we do differently going forward at policy and service level.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I can't resist to add, there is also one for the newborn period, so nurturing care for every newborn. And so that looks at, the routine care that every woman and baby needs to receive, but also what needs to happen for babies who are born small or sick, and, the support they may need to receive either in sort of specialized or even intensive care units. So, there's more material to be looked at. And just to illustrate also that this is integrative then, when we talk about nurturing care, maybe some of you are familiar with the Baby Friendly Hospital initiative that was so prominent in the 90s. Today we want to say you can't do nurturing care without having, adhering to the principles of the Baby Friendly Hospital initiative, because mothers and babies should not be separated. Baby should be fed on demand, this, that, and the other. So in that way, it's not a concept that tries to bring many elements together that come through health, nutrition, and so forth, and add then this extra dimensions that Sheila has spoken about: responsive caregiving, early learning, aspects of safety and security. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
There's also one under development around responsive feeding, which you'll hear more about that in the next webinar, I think.
Okay, I think we are coming slowly but surely to the end of this webinar series. Not to us, but we are eager to learn more. Okay, Bangladesh, fantastic. Many greetings to Bangladesh. Fantastic. Okay, let me. So I would like to thank you, first of all, Bernadette and Sheila, for this fantastic talk and for taking part in this really, really insightful presentation and insightful talk. We learned a lot today, and I look very much forward to the next webinar, which will take place next week at the same time. And it will be about how can we strengthen nurturing care through health and nutritional service. We will have a specialist from UNICEF, Anne, who will be talking about the nurturing care framework, if I understood well, and also Raphael and Amber from the Yale School of Public Health. So I look very much forward to the next week. We will dig deeper into this topic, and I would like to thank you all for taking part. I will put all the necessary links and resources together, and I will send it in the next day. So thank you so much and take care.